Hello, everyone. Again, as I'll probably say every time, hopefully I haven't been cut off in mid-sentence, but if you're here, you should be here for topic 2 for this week in our American History 2 course. As I mentioned in the last video you watched, today we're going to be looking at World War I, both at home and abroad, but of course primarily focusing on America's role in the war and its impact upon American society. As always, to start things off, we'll look at some of the key terms for today. First, we're of course, as you might imagine, going to look at the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. We'll look at the Lusitania. We'll look at the Zimmermann Telegram. We'll look at the Bolshevik Revolution. And we'll look at the Treaty of Versailles to wrap things up. Again, as always, keep your upcoming dates in mind. By the time you're viewing this, your debate materials are probably due pretty soon. So if you participate in the live debate, make sure that your outline and or research you did is ready to be turned in. For those of you who are doing the alternate assignment, make sure that is completed as soon as possible. If you have questions with about either of these assignments, please let me know as soon as you can. Then, like I mentioned last time, your content quiz will be coming up the next week, and your midterm writing assignment is coming up towards the end of this month. Make sure you are as aware and prepared for these assignments as you possibly can be. Now, in the meantime, one of the first things I want to mention is to give you a chance to review one of the readings you had assigned for this week on African American involvement in World War I. In case you haven't already noticed, racial relations, just particularly focusing on African Americans, are a big part of this course, so that's going to be something that keeps coming up. World War I has been identified as a pretty major milestone moment for African American activism and rights in this country. One thing I want you to be prepared to do is to explain in a little more detail why. So, if you haven't already done the reading, make sure you do so and keep these questions in mind. What were some of the major goals African Americans were after when fighting in World War I? Why did World War I in particular inspire them to achieve these goals? How well were these goals actually accomplished? And finally, how did the success of these goals, or the lack thereof, reflect upon American character during World War I? So again, keep those questions in mind. They will come up in other wars that were with African American involvement that we'll discuss in the future. Also keep in mind this is probably very similar, as you might have noticed, to the African American experience in the Spanish American War. So keep that in mind. This is not a new issue. Now, to start things off, we're going to look at some of the major causes of World War I to help give you a bit of context. Historians have identified 4 major causes for the start of this war. First, you have imperialism. Why might imperialism, which in case you don't know, means where a country goes over, takes over, and sets up colonies in other countries, why might that cause war? Imaginary pause again. Excuse me. Yeah, for those of you who are aware of how imperialism typically goes throughout history, when these countries start setting up their empires, they're usually not very polite about respecting other people's boundaries. Remember, the whole point of setting up an empire is to compete with other empires and try to snatch up as much resources and wealth as you can. So when Britain gets their empire set up, Germany is not going to just be polite and let them have it. There's going to be some competition there. This can help encourage conflict. This was made worse by mutual defense alliances. Mutual defense alliances are what you can see here, with these being the ones that were set up by the time of World War I. Essentially, what you have is these countries will form alliances with each other, and since it's a mutual defense alliance, they pledge, essentially, that if one country is attacked in the alliance, then everyone else will come to their support. Now, why might that make a war worse? Alright, just give me a second to look at this. Imaginary class. Alright, so yeah, as you might imagine, it's essentially a domino effect when it comes to conflict. So let's say you just have Britain and Germany existing in a vacuum, and they go to war. That's just going to be between those two countries. But when you have France and Russia allied with Britain, if Germany goes to war with Britain, these two countries are going to get pulled in. Then Austria, Hungary, and Italy might get pulled in as well, leads to a world war. Militarism, as you might expect, was also a major cause of the war and was directly linked to these first two issues. Once these huge empires were made, they started forming these alliances. Many countries became obsessed with advancing and growing their military as much as possible. So this, of course, ensured that once a war broke out, it was going to be much larger and more devastating than it might have been if countries weren't already preparing. Finally, this is going to be something we're going to look at a lot throughout the rest of the semester, hopefully, is nationalism. Can anyone tell me what nationalism is and whether it's a good thing? And also keep in mind what its difference is with patriotism. Imaginary, just me staring at the camera waiting for the answer. But yeah, for those of you who are familiar with nationalism, nationalism is considered by most political scientists to be a huge prioritizing of your country's goals and desires, an intense desire to go achieve those goals, and typically to separate from patriotism, putting it at the expense of other countries' interests. So patriotism is, of course, where you're just very passionate about your country, you love your country, and you're very loyal to your country. Most historians and political scientists, like I said, consider nationalism to be the next step. This is where you would put your not only love your country and its needs, you put them at the expense of other countries. So if you have to hurt another country by accomplishing your goal, if you're very nationalistic, you're very willing to do it. This, of course, again ties back into the imperialism and mutual defense alliances. If you're willing to wreck over another country in order to increase your empire, that of course could lead to conflict. Now, as many of you are probably aware, what is considered to be the main cause of World War I is the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Prince Ferdinand was the Archduke of Austria-Hungary before World War I. This is essentially the Austria-Hungary Empire's equivalent of a vice president. On June 28, 1914, he and his wife Sophie, the Duchess of Hohenberg, were assassinated by a Serbian nationalist group called the Black Hand. If you go back to this mutual defense alliance chart, you can see here that Serbia was allied with Russia, France, and Great Britain. They were officially a part of the Austria-Hungary Empire. So essentially they were trying to fight for independence, like many of the other groups we've talked about in the past. So again, like I said, they were motivated by a desire to control Austrian territories in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, this seems like an isolated incident on the surface. Why do you think it's going to actually lead to a global war? I'll give you a second to ponder that. Alright, so yes, as you can probably see, it's again, those mutual alliance defense contracts. Because these different empires are so heavily allied against each other, when one country goes to war, at this point it's going to often drag in many more. So some of the immediate responses following the assassination. So again, the assassination was on June 28, 1914. By July the 28th, Austria-Hungary had gone ahead and declared war on Serbia. By August the 1st, Germany had declared war on Russia. Why do you think they would do that, by the way? Again, it goes back to the mutual alliance charts. Russia is allied with Serbia, so Germany's going ahead and jumping the gun and attacking the ally or the enemy of their ally. Wait a second. Then by the 3rd, Germany went ahead and declared war on France and invaded Belgium. By August the 4th, Great Britain had gone around and declared war on Germany. So essentially what's going on is what you can see in this picture right here. Serbia starts a bit of a conflict. Austria-Hungary comes in to attack. Russia comes in to defend their ally. Germany comes in to defend their ally. France comes in, and then it's just a never-ending chain. Allies keep getting pulled into this war. Now, as many of you might also know, early on in the war, the United States was actually officially neutral. As soon as all these war declarations were made, Woodrow Wilson was very quick to announce that the United States would not be joining them. Now, one thing I do want to focus on for just a moment is why you think the United States did remain neutral in World War I. Yeah, this one's probably very obvious, so I won't stay on it too much. The United States did profit hugely from remaining neutral. Initially in the war, they actually did sell weapons and ammunition to both sides. Some of the benefits are probably pretty obvious. They made a ton of money selling to both sides of the war. However, what might be some of the consequences of this? Give you a second to think. All right, well, imagine, let's say, for example, that you're Germany in World War I and you recognize that your enemies are getting a lot of their ammunition from the United States. What might you try to do then? Exactly. You're going to try to cut them off from that source of ammunition and weapons. So this actually does put a target on the United States' back because both sides are trying to claim exclusive access to the United States as a resource. Now, just to give you a basic idea of what the war was like as a whole for Europe, World War I in Europe was fought on two fronts. Germany and Austria-Hungary were located in the middle. Now, why might this be a clear disadvantage, especially for Germany and Austria-Hungary? All right, yeah, this one again, if you look at the map, is probably pretty obvious. Well, for example, Russia only has to fight on the Eastern Front, and France and Great Britain really only have to fight on the Western Front. Germany and Austria-Hungary are both committed essentially to fighting on both fronts. They have to defend both of their major borders at the exact same time. So this, of course, was made it very difficult for Germany to hold out while being invaded simultaneously. The Western Front was located primarily in central France, as you can see right around in here. This is where conflict occurred between France, Germany, Belgium, and Great Britain primarily. The Eastern Front primarily consisted of the Russia invasion of Germany and Austria-Hungary. Now, to give you a bit of an idea of what trench warfare was like, I would like for you to go ahead and watch one of the trailers from the recent movie 1917, which came out a little over a year ago. What I want you to look out for when you watch this trailer is to look at some of the realities of what trench warfare was like and be prepared to discuss them for future assignments. I would play this for you, but I obviously can't because I might get copyright striked. Again, I'll give you a few little bit to go ahead and pause this recording if you haven't already. Watch the video, then we'll come back. Alright, so I'm going to assume you've watched the video now and you've resumed this video. One thing I want to mention before we move on is that one major aspect of this trailer has been identified as not being historically accurate. Can you guess what it is? Right. Unfortunately, it's actually not the violence depicted, the landscape destruction depicted, or anything like that. For those of you who are aware of what World War I was like, the casualties, for reasons we'll get into in a second, were immense in this war. So if you saw the trailer, you know that this whole mission was to save just about 1,600 men. In the Battle of the Somme, for example, which is one of the most infamous battles on the Western Front, between both sides there were roughly 1 million casualties or more. Way more than 1,600, obviously. So as I go into more detail about in a second, many historians are convinced that since these commanders were so willing to lose huge amounts of soldiers, they wouldn't mount such a detailed operation just to save 1,600. So it's a bit more of a depressing example of historical inaccuracy. But anyway, a little bit more about trench warfare characteristics. The Western and Eastern Front were both covered with miles and miles of trenches. There were roughly 35,000 miles of trenches on the Western and the Eastern Front. A couple of the main problems you need to be aware of with trench warfare. One was their use of machine guns and old military tactics. For those of you who are aware of the basics of how old military tactics were used, essentially when you had muskets and things like that, the armies would just line up straight in front of each other, fire a little bit, advance, and just keep firing on each other. This was pretty effective at the time, relatively, because for those of you who are aware, or let me just actually give you a moment to guess while you're at home. Can anyone tell me what was the average fire rate per minute of a musket? All right, hopefully you've guessed by now. It did vary a little bit as technology advanced, but for a Revolutionary War musket, for example, and even mostly by the Civil War, even the best soldiers could only fire about an average of 1 round per minute. So very slow rate of fire, obviously. So this isn't a huge deal, especially since the guns were inaccurate, when you just line up and fire straight at each other. However, once you start having more advanced weapons like this that can have a much greater rate of fire per minute, if you just line up your soldiers and send them to advance upon the enemy, they're going to get mowed down. So that is, for example, in the Battle of the Somme, That is one reason why the casualties were so high in World War I. People are still trying to fight the same way they did in traditional European combat, but the technology has improved to such a degree that that's not really effective anymore. Artillery was also hugely effective at this point, along with the infamous no man's land in between each trench. As you hopefully saw in that video of the 1917 trailer, the no man's land was of course covered with huge amounts of craters, barbed wire was all over the place, and artillery fire was landing almost constantly across those areas. Because of this, it was very hard for trench warfare to have a successful invasion. Not only did you have to worry again about this machine gun fire, no man's land was almost impossible to get through because of all the obstacles. So even if you weren't killed outright by the enemy's weapons, you would oftentimes get stuck in no man's land and be killed later anyway. Lastly, you of course have the infamous use of chemical warfare, especially mustard gas. Mustard gas was infamous for the fact that even if it didn't kill you, it oftentimes would permanently blind you or lead to some other kind of defect. So chemical warfare, of course, made even the wounded or the veteran experience terrible, and was one of the major reasons chemical warfare would later be outlawed. So again, and particularly the trenches didn't help with this at all as well, as you might imagine. When you have people cooped up in these tight trenches, it's very easy for the mustard gas to get in and spread around and infect many people at once. So again, trench warfare was really not that effective of a military plan at this point. Now, let's get a little more specifically into what America did in the war. Historians have come up with 5 major reasons for why America entered the war. The first being the sinking of the British ship Lusitania in 1915. This vessel was sunk due to the fact that the British had military supplies on board. However, 128 Americans were also on board. Of course, this is going to enrage the public, as you might imagine. However, one of the more direct reasons that America has been identified as entering the war is the 1917 Zimmermann telegram. In this telegram, a German diplomat named Zimmermann offered Mexico lost territory if they declared war on America. As you can see here, they're trying to seek an alliance with Mexico. Now, why might this appeal so much to Mexico, actually? This is a bit of an American History 1 question. Yeah, as you hopefully remember from American History 1, if you've taken that at some point, Mexico had recently, not too long before this, just back in the 1830s, not long in the grand scheme of things, had lost a huge chunk of their territory to the United States in the Mexican-American War. Germany offered to give it back. Unrestricted submarine warfare was also a major issue. German U-boats were infamous for sinking down vessels that had any military supplies on board, such as the Lusitania. This again goes back to the U.S.'s neutrality issues. Like I said, staying neutral and giving military weapons to both sides can make you a target. Germany wasn't willing to let any supplies reach their enemies, even if the ships were technically neutral. Economic interests were also a big deal as well. If you remember when we talked about some of the robber barons, many of these American businessmen, including J.P. Morgan, the banker, had given about $3 billion in loans to the Allied powers. Now, why might this influence the United States' decision to go to war? Awkward pause again. But think, if Germany wins the war and Austria-Hungary wins the war, what do you think the likelihood is that these businessmen are going to get their money back? Pretty low, right? So again, the economic interests were a big deal as well. Finally, there were some alleged German atrocities in Belgium, many of which were just British lies and propaganda, but they still did turn public opinion against Germany over time. One other major thing I want to focus on is the Russian exit from the war. The war did not go very well for the Russian Empire, so by October through November of 1917, Russia had went through the infamous Bolshevik Revolution. This was led by the Marxist revolutionary Vladimir Lenin. Now, does anyone know what philosophy this revolution believed in? Alright, very good, imaginary class again. This is, of course, the start of the first communist state in the entire world. Vladimir Lenin and his Bolsheviks were believers in Marxism and communism. As a result of this revolution, the Russian Civil War erupted between 1917 and 1922, and by 1922 the Soviet Union had been established. This, of course, is historically significant because this is considered to be the start of this is officially the start of the Soviet Union, which of course would be our major rival throughout the Cold War of the 20th century. So this is one reason World War I do believe deserves a lot of attention in history, is because it did lead to this great superpower getting formed, which would lead to the great communist and capitalist divide across the world. So if you want to look for some of the starts of the Cold War, you need to go back to at least here. Now, end of the war, we have to go ahead and, just for the interest of time, move a little bit into the end of the war. Now, America's entry into this war was considered pretty significant. Why do you think that might be the case? Imaginary audience. Oh, we gotta love these pauses. But yeah, this is a pretty simple answer. It'd be like if you were in a fight for an extended period of time, and then your friend swooped in at the last minute. Many of these countries, of course, as you might imagine, with these huge death tolls, were depleted of men and resources, did not have much morale left. But America was essentially a fresh body to throw into the war. So America essentially gave that final push that was necessary to help win World War I. For example, between August and September of 1918, the Allied offensive with American aid was finally able to push into Germany through the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest to the German border. For instance, this quote you can see right here from First Sergeant Dan Daly came from this campaign when U.S. Marines were trying to push through France and get into Germany. Also, the 1918 Spanish influenza, which is much more relevant now to when I first taught this, but this outbreak began in 1918. The death toll is roughly estimated to have been between 40 and 100 million, which of course depletes your fighting force and your support service back home even more, hurts morale across the board. By November 11th on 1918, which is still celebrated as Armistice Day or Veterans Day, by the way, Germany officially signed an armistice, agreed to surrender their weapons, surrender most of their navy, and evacuate all occupied territory. Now, this leads us into arguably the most important part of World War I for later world history, which is, of course, the infamous Treaty of Versailles. If you know anything about Nazi propaganda, you'll know that this is a very hotly discussed topic by many Germans after the war. On June 28, 1919, this document was signed at the Paris Peace Conference and officially ended World War I. Few of the major provisions you need to be aware of. Germany was required to accept the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage. So essentially, you guys caused the war, it's your fault. They lost 25,000 square miles of territory, and about 7 million of their citizens went along with this territory. They lost control of all their former colonies. Their army and navy was restricted, down to 100,000 soldiers, 36 boats, and no submarines. And these boats also couldn't get higher than 200 tons. And finally, they had to pay 132 billion marks in reparations to the Allied powers. In today's money, this would be about 442 billion US dollars. Now, just to summarize some of the effects of this treaty, what were the Allies' goals with this treaty? What were they trying to accomplish with it? Okay, as you might be able to see, not only are they trying to push the responsibility of the war upon Germany and condemn them for it in the eyes of the public, they're also trying to take away Germany's ability to ever be a threat again. They're taking their colonies and their territory, a big source of their revenue, and of course also directly restricting their military abilities and putting economic hardships upon them. So essentially, it's to blame and punish Germany for the war and to try to make sure they'll never be a threat again. Obviously, that didn't work out so well. Now, how might these provisions affect Germany? Well, yes, of course, there's the obvious financial and direct losses. You're losing all this territory. Your navy, your army isn't powerful anymore, and you're economically dependent and hurt by these allied powers. But as you might also imagine, there's a bit of a national pride issue as well. For many, people saw this as the betrayal and the destruction of Germany. they were worried that Germany would essentially never be able to be a prosperous and great nation again. How might that in turn create an opportunity for the Nazis? Well, we'll look at that, of course, a bit more next week. But as you might imagine, this is a great opportunity for the Nazis because they can offer to be the solution to all these problems. As you'll see in many other history classes, times of crisis are often great opportunities for fringe organizations like the Nazis. But in the meantime, do again remember your upcoming assignments. Please let me know if you have any questions about them. But in the meantime, have a great rest of your day and try to enjoy your week. Thank you.